Hello, welcome to Backstory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein, and my guest today is with us all the way from London, England. And this is the amazing thing about taping on Zoom. And I want to introduce you to the author of a very, very interesting book that he's recently published. And I'm going to let you, it's called Audacious Goals, Remarkable Results. I'd like you to meet Brad Borkin. Hello, Brad.
Hello, Joan. It's great to be here, and it's really good to see you and to be part of this whole show, because I remember that we did a show about, like you say, about 3 years ago about my first book, which was When Your Life Depends on It, about the early Antarctic explorers. And this new book builds upon that in a way. What it was my co-author and I, David Herzl, who's based in California, we're looking around saying, what can we write next? We've written about the early explorers and the life and death decisions they made on the ice. And we said, let's look at 11 of the great accomplishments that happened, say, between 1850 and 1914, about before the start of World War One, and when the world was really changing and reshaping a lot. And we said, let's write about 11 things. We'll just pick 11 as a number. And we started thinking about aviation, about the invention of the airplane was in 1903, cars, and all-terrain vehicles. And we were interested in things not just in the first, like who got to the South Pole or the North Pole or the top of Everest, or various things that were happening, or people trying to get places like the top of Everest. But there were other things happening in the world as well in terms of geographic achievement. And there were things like the building of the Panama Canal and the start of the railways and the building of tunnels and the building of various structures. And we started looking at this, and what we discovered was something quite remarkable, that three names kept reappearing. And those three names were Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who probably very few Americans have ever heard of, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. Theodore Roosevelt, who every American will have heard of, and Roald Amundsen, who's an explorer. And we kept seeing these names come up time and time again. And we thought, what is it about these three people? Like, let's stop writing about these 11 things and let's start writing about these three unique and remarkable individuals. And that's what the book is about. And the book, what is interesting about the three is that one is an explorer, that's Roald Amundsen. One's an engineer, and that's Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and one's a statesman and president, Theodore Roosevelt. And it's like, here we have three different people in three different professions and from three different countries doing very remarkable things in this very unusual period of history.
Okay, let's talk about this. And your title, which is so interesting, is Audacious Goals and Remarkable Results. So in other words, these people had big dreams, big ideas, and they did what they needed to do to make the discoveries happen. And that is what Brad and David discovered about these people. What were the qualities that they had that made them able to do what they did, you see? What does it take?
That's right. What we discovered when we were started with this idea that there would be these 11 topics, and what we realized early on was that we're making these spreadsheets about these 11 topics. And what we came up with was that each was involved in two big endeavors of these 11. And when you look at the 11, it's really quite a remarkable thing. And in fact, some of them were actually involved in 3 or 4 different big endeavors. But so what we started writing about was that Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who's the engineer, was the first to build a tunnel under a flowing river. Now, nowadays, we think about going into New York City or going through the Holland Tunnel or the Lincoln Tunnel. We just take tunnels for granted. And yet someone had to be the first to figure out, how do you build a tunnel under a river, where it's one thing building a tunnel through a mountain because you've got solid rock to build through. But under a riverbed, you've got the sand and silt and gravel, and it's all wet. And so it's, how do you do that with the weight of the river flowing on top of it. And then then he was one of the pioneers in railroads. So he was involved in two big things. And then there was Theodore Roosevelt, who was involved with the national parks and protecting land for using legislation to protect land, all the national forests and things like that in America. And he also was instrumental in the Panama Canal, which is an absolutely fascinating story.
Absolutely. And he gives a good example of how people work with other people to get advisors, knowledgeable people. So when they're working on the Panama Canal, the workers are getting very sick from malaria, wasn't it? Or no?
Oh, yellow fever.
Yellow fever. And they mistakenly was believed that the yellow fever was coming from bad water or something. And it was the man that Roosevelt found who was experienced in that area, that geographic area, a doctor who said, no, it's mosquitoes. It's the biting of these mosquitoes that's causing this illness and it's killing people, killing the workers. So what he did is you have to be smart enough to respect other people's intelligence and work with them. And that's one of the interesting aspects of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's a great example because actually Dr. Gorgas, who is this doctor who had worked in Cuba, and he realized that yellow fever, the general belief was yellow fever came from bad sanitation, and that what he realized was it came from mosquitoes. The bad sanitation led to more mosquitoes, basically. And so it was these mosquitoes that were spreading it. And he went to the Canal Commission after Roosevelt had set up something called the Canal Commission, which was overseeing all expenditures. And Gorgas asked for $1 million to set up a program to kill all the mosquitoes in the canal zone. And the Canal Commission said, well, that's an interesting proposition, but we'll give you $50,000. So Gorgas took his case to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, well, gee, I need some expert opinion. How am I going to figure out if this is really worth $1 million, which is a massive sum in those days. It would have been the biggest health undertaking the world had ever seen. And he goes to so Roosevelt has his personal presidential doctor. He goes to the presidential doctor and says, what do you think? And the doctor said, you want the canal to work? You've got to fund Dr. Gorgas's program entirely. And Roosevelt does. He wasn't afraid of big decisions. He wasn't afraid to say he made a mistake and turn things around. And so it was recognizing that Canal Commission was not the overseer of everything, that there had to be external influences and external advice. And so it's just a remarkable story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's Amundsen, too.
Amundsen was remarkable in that he did two big things. The first was the Northwest Passage. So if you envision the world, you've got Europe on one side, Asia on the other side, and across, if you want to get from Europe to Asia to trade goods, which they were very interested in doing, they had to go, at this point, there was no Panama Canal. There was, but across the top of Canada, there's a belief that you could get through all the various islands in the Arctic region of Canada, that somehow there must be a route through. And the route was called the Northwest Passage. But for 400 or 500 years, people have been seeking the Northwest Passage. So famous explorers, Henry Hudson was one, Cabot was another, Sir John Franklin from the Great British Navy was trying to find the Northwest Passage. This was one of the prize for finding the Northwest Passage. At one point, the British government was going to give a prize for it, and it'd be 5 times what the Nobel Prize today would award for winning a Nobel Prize. So and in those days, it's just an astronomical sum of money. That's how valued this route was. And for 400 years, 500 years, people were seeking this, and Amundsen figured out a way to solve the puzzle of how do you get through all the islands. And then he was the first to the South Pole, which is another remarkable feat. And so it's these 3 people who are just so remarkable in their ability to say, I see a problem, I'm going to figure out what the solution is, and I'm the guy to do it.
Yeah, So, and and as you say, people have heard of Roosevelt, of course, because he was an American president. They may have heard of Amundsen, but certainly they haven't heard of Brunel. Isn't that
Right.
interesting? And yet he did some amazing things.
Absolutely. Actually, just to put this in perspective, because this is just a wonderful story. In 2002, the BBC did a program and they said, let's figure out let's list 100 of the greatest British people who have ever lived. So when you think about the 100 greatest British people who have ever lived, be like Darwin, Shakespeare, Newton, Faraday, Churchill, Princess Diana. It's like John Lennon. It's like you can make. It's easy to come up with a list. I mean, Britain's been influential in the world for many, many years. And they did a program where each person had a 10-minute profile and the public voted. And so the show ran for many, many weeks. So each week there were maybe 6 or 7 profiles done, and it was very popular. And then the public voted. So number one, who do you think was number one?
Darwin? No.
Close. Darwin was number 5. Churchill. Sorry,
Churchill.
Darwin was number 4, I think. So number 1 was Churchill, who's everyone should have heard of. Number 2 was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He came above Darwin, Newton, Shakespeare, and all the others. And it's just like, and you sit there and go like, he has such a household name in Britain for what he's achieved, and his bridges and tunnels and railways and everything are all over the country. And yet at the same time, he is unknown outside of Britain. And it's just a remarkable story. And so part of the value of the book is bringing this, what he did to light. Because the interesting thing about the tunnel, I would just take the tunnel as an example, the method that they pioneered to build the Thames Tunnel, which is the first tunnel under a flowing river, which had to be dug by hand. They designed, his father, Brunel's father was an engineer, as well as Isambard Kingdom Brunel himself. And his father had designed this thing called a tunneling shield, which is this iron structure that the men stood in, basically. And you build the brickwork behind as the tunnel's being built, being dug out. And this tunneling shield methodology has been used for every tunnel ever built since then. And this tunnel was built in the 1820s. And so the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, any tunnel for any metro system, subway system, these are all built the same way. If it's a bored tunnel, and so it's just a remarkable occurrence. And then this tunnel they built, which you can still see today in London, and it's still used today, it is, if you looked at the tunnels in the world, and there are many enormous tunnels, long tunnels, the aperture of the tunnel, so the circular of the tunnel aperture would be in the top 10 largest tunnels ever built. So it's not the length of the tunnel, but the size of what they dug out of the earth is just remarkable. And it's just these people, both Roosevelt, Amundsen, and Brunel all looked at the world and just were like, why can't we do something? They never saw it as, we can't do that. Even though everybody else around them was saying, you'll never build a Panama Canal, you'll never build a tunnel under a river, you'll never get to find the Northwest Passage. Yet these guys did. And it was just a remarkable drive that they had.
Do you think we have this today? Do you think that we have people in our world today? Because, as you point out, 1914, World War I starts, and many of the things that they were focusing on gets put aside because of this war. So this was an era that had its closure, you might say. What about today? What about our world, our life today? Do we have people of great achievement? Do we have people trying to solve problems?
I think very much so. I think there's some, you certainly have the Steve Jobs and the Tim Cook from Apple. You've got the Elon Musk, you've got Jeff Bezos, you've got a lot of people doing interesting things who are very driven, and probably in some ways no different than what Brunel and Roosevelt and Amundsen were. They were all flawed individuals, so we don't want to portray them as perfect human beings or perfect decision makers. Just like you could argue about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all these different people, they all had flaws, and I think and whether people in modern society do or in previous but they overcame various flaws, but also some of those flaws were what made them successful. As much as we may say they're not nice, Steve Jobs was very much, everyone said he's not a nice person, but it was that ability to never be satisfied and to be argumentative, and that perhaps will help propel him to success.
Wow. So your interest is mainly on decision making, leadership and decision making. And why does it matter to us? Why should we care?
Well, the world needs leadership to a very great degree nowadays, and it's interesting to look at history not from the point of view of dates and times. In fact, our book doesn't even talk about the birth of Brunel or the birth of Roosevelt. We're not interested in history as a biography of what these people did when they were born, when they died, and what happened in between. What we're interested in is these big feats of endeavor, and that leadership in these feats of endeavor are really what we need. If you're going to solve pandemics, you're going to solve climate change, you're going to solve the big challenges that the world faces, water crises, getting enough food for growing populations, migration, all the different things we've got in the world, the challenges that we have, then you need leaders to say, I'm going to solve that problem, that specific problem. Much in the way Roosevelt said, for 400 years, people are trying to figure out where they could build a canal, how they would build a canal. The French did a monumental effort to build a canal in the 1870s across Panama, 1880s, and failed miserably. And Roosevelt comes in 1903 and says, and just goes, I'm president now. He became president because McKinley was shot and killed. So Roosevelt becomes president. He's 42 years old. He's the youngest president ever to take office at that point in time. He's a young man. He had been governor. His history was he was governor of New York State. And within a year and a half of being governor of New York State, he becomes McKinley's running mate. They run together. McKinley wins the presidency. Roosevelt's the vice president. And next minute, within 6 months, McKinley's shot and killed and Roosevelt's president. And rather than sitting around going, now what do? He goes, I'm going to build the Panama Canal. I'm going to protect all this land. I'm going to do things that need to be done. And he just said, I'm the guy to do it. And that's what I think is so remarkable. He just was going to persevere through.
Two things that interested me about him. One is that he created the battleground, you might say, for national parks in the West. And how he became interested in that is that as a child, he was not a well child. He had asthma and he was weak, but his parents took him on hiking trips. And it was on hiking trips that he discovered the West. He discovered these mountains in the West. And that's what got him to thinking that they should preserve these parks and let people go there and hike in them and walk in them. So that became one of his interesting goals. The other thing that I found interesting about him from what you wrote, he went into the field. He didn't imagine what he was going to do or what it was going to look like. He went into the field. He went to the canal, where the Panama Canal. He didn't keep distant from the projects. He was very much on top of them. One time he goes down and he eats lunch with the workers, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, and that's a very important thing because I'm a sociologist, and one of the things I loved about sociology was going into the field, not sitting and making up theories about things that I didn't even see. I liked going into the field, and that's what he was doing. Roosevelt loved being in the field. he wanted to be close to the world he wanted to help and change. And I think that's also true for Amundsen too, wasn't it?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, they're all very much
All of
outdoors
them.
people,
Yeah.
and that's they. Yeah, so everything Amundsen was doing was outdoors, and Roosevelt as well. And Roosevelt, I mean, there are wonderful stories about Roosevelt that were discovering as we went. Like he would do all these adventuresome things. Like you were saying, he was very sickly as a child, but somehow overcame his asthma and then developed into a very strong human being. And he wasn't that tall, but he was just very determined and very strong. And even when he was in the White House, he would have these things where he'd be like, let's go from this point to that point. Like go into the forest, go from this point to that point. We're going to go in a straight line, and we're nothing, whatever in the way is going to block our way. If we're going to climb over it, we'll swim across it, whatever, streams, and if it was a hut, they'd climb over. It's like literally they go a straight line. It's like just a remarkable, funny stories about him. But he was very focused on doing things that were, like you're saying, being hands-on. He went down to the Canal Zone in the rainy season because he wanted to see it at its worst. He didn't say want a prim and proper presidential visit. He wanted, and he goes down by ship because that's the way he was going to get there, and he immediately leaves the ship. He basically runs away from the ship. He basically leaves the ship. Everyone's wondering where he's gone, and he's just gone off and starts wandering around and talking with workers and talking with people, and he sets his own agenda, sets his own schedule. Just, but Brunel was the same. Brunel was building the Great Western Railway. So Great Western Railway is the first real modern style train line. When we think about taking a train, like when you're taking a train from Philadelphia to New York, in fact, this is very relevant to an audience from Princeton. When you take the train from Philadelphia to New York, why doesn't the train go to Princeton, the center of Princeton? Why do you take the dinky into Princeton? That's because of Brunel. Brunel said that if you're going to build train lines and you want to connect, and his focus at the beginning was connecting London to Bristol. And if you're connecting London to Bristol and you're drawing a straight line from London to Bristol, he's saying if you want to get from London to Bristol as fast as possible, you don't want to take a detour by way of Windsor. Windsor is where Windsor Castle is. So there's big push in England to say, well, certainly it should go near where the Queen is, where the Queen has a castle. And he's like, no, if you want the fastest route possible, you want to have trunk lines that go off. So you go London to Bristol, and if you need to get to Windsor, you're going to take a trunk line. If you want to get to Princeton, if you want to get the fastest way from Philadelphia to New York, you go on the most level route possible, because trains can't go up and down. They've got to stay on a level route. You draw a straight line, you basically try to follow that path, and you say, oh, we need to get to Princeton, we'll just do a trunk line. And that's what one of the things Brunel pioneered. And that's been, train lines around the world are influenced by Brunel. But when he was going to plan out the London to Bristol train line, he did it on horseback in 10 weeks. And I don't know if your listeners and viewers will be aware of how undulating the British countryside is. I was just on this train line just a few weeks ago, and it's unbelievable how many streams and creeks and rivers and things this train line is going over, and the countryside is going like this all across it. But he went on horseback for 10 weeks and figured out what is the most level route possible. And they say even now with topographic maps, satellite imagery, and everything else, you probably couldn't have gotten a better line for a train line than what he found. It's just unbelievable, remarkable stuff. And bridges he built for the train line are still existing. There needed to be a tunnel. At one point, there needed to be a tunnel that was 2 miles long. No one had ever built a tunnel of anywhere close to that magnitude. And he's like, well, we need to build a tunnel. We'll just build the tunnel through this mountain. And it's going to take 5 years. I'm going to start at one end and start at the other end, and we'll meet at the middle. And I'll leave it to your audience to read the book to find out how close they got. But it is shockingly amazing what they achieved, and it took 5 years to build the tunnel, and it's and just things like that. The tunnel's still in use today.
That's pretty amazing. It's still in use today.
And it's just, I mean, the Thames Tunnel is still in use today. This thing was built 175 years ago, and trains, London Underground trains, go through it all the time. And they say it's the longest tunnel under the Thames that the London Underground has. And it's also the most watertight. I mean, all the tunnels drip a bit, leak a little bit, and it's the most watertight and the longest and the oldest. And it was dug by hand. It's unbelievable. And that's what makes the stories fun and interesting.
Okay, so having done this, and by the way, where can the book be purchased?
Well, the book's on Amazon. And we're going to have an audiobook coming out probably by the end of the year. But for now, it's in Kindle form and in print form. And
okay, where does it take you now? In other words, when you did your first book that I had you on my show 3 years ago, that was about an adventure, an explorer. Then you moved into this with 3 interesting adventures. Where do you see yourself going next, or aren't you there yet?
Well, my co-author David and I are talking about this, whether we write a book. This is a book, happens to be about 3 men, and whether we write a book about more women, that has more women in it, that has more diversity in it, and that's what we're toying with right now. Is it happened that when you look at geographical history in the world, it was and you're looking back from 1820 to 1914, it was fundamentally men doing this sort of big geographical work. But there is equally very interesting other people, Amelia Earhart and other figures around the world that just have fascinating stories and stories that need to be told in the way that we tell stories, which is talking about lessons learned and lessons. What can you use for modern day living and modern decision making that can come from these remarkable people and these remarkable stories?
So you're going to keep on going, like the men you write about.
That's right. That's
you're
right.
Keep on going, and you found your way, and I think it's very interesting. When you start working on the women, please talk to me.
Oh, definitely will do. And
yeah, I know.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, just to talk about very briefly, is that when we started the book, we thought we were writing about an explorer, an engineer, and a statesman. That's part of the title. Audacious Goals, Remarkable Results, how an explorer, an engineer, and a statesman shaped our modern world. But we learned something very interesting at the end of it, was that each of them had that skill set. They each were, yes, Roosevelt was a statesman, but he also had the desire to explore. He also saw things from an engineering perspective. He was very interested in the engineering of the canal. And Roosevelt was Amundsen was very much had engineering skills and statesman skills, and Brunel as well had the different skills. And what we realized, we came to this realization that to solve big problems in today's society, you need those 3 skills. And that if you look at problems like pandemics, and you look at problems like climate change, and that if you look at them from the point of view of an explorer, an engineer, and a statesman all at the same time, you start coming up with more creative solutions.
Yeah, you have more depth. You have more depth and dimension to your analysis. Well, Brad Borkin, how lovely that you came all the way from London, England.